Okay, I think perhaps we'll make a start. We've got one more panel member to come, and we know he's here because we've seen him. We're just tracking him down as we go. So I'm Nev Young. I'm Director of Enterprise Innovation at Health Innovation Yorkshire and Humber. So I work with both Tim and Neil, who were on before. I haven't got a list of 10 things. I was going to do 20, but I think we'll maybe put that list down for now. And I think what we're going to talk about in this panel session today is barriers to innovation, really, but I think we're going to try and do it in a positive way. So barriers and how to overcome those. 2 minutes, okay. And so we've got a great panel with us today, and we've got some people with real expertise from different bits of the innovation ecosystem, I think it's fair to say. And I'm going to let them introduce themselves and tell you a little bit about them and their roles. I've got some questions that have been helpfully prepared for me. Thank you, V. But actually, towards the end of the session, we're going to come to you in the crowd. You've all been here for 2 days. There's an opportunity to ask our experts a few questions yourselves. So start getting your thinking hats on now about the sorts of questions you might want to ask. And if I don't see any hands up, I might pick on some of you. Some of you I know, and so I will pick on you to ask questions. So get prepared, Ben, Ian, etc. Marcus, so you have been warned. So I'll let the panel introduce themselves, and I'll tell you a little bit about them and what they do and how they interact with the wider community, and we'll go from there. So Anne, over to you first.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. My name's Anne Blackwood. I'm Chief Executive of an organisation called Health Tech Enterprise. We're a health technology consultancy based in Cambridge. We do 2 things. We provide innovation management services to around 18 or 19 NHS trusts, primarily in the east of England and London. And we also work with a lot of startups and SMEs, helping them put together their business case for adoption in the NHS and other healthcare systems. So we have access to health economics expertise, an understanding of clinical insights and market insights and all of the sorts of things you need to do to put together a business case to convince a buyer to purchase your product. I'm also chair of a women's health company called Ablatus, which is developing an RF ablation technology system for the treatment of uterine fibroids, amongst other things.
Hi there. Thank you for sticking around. So my name is Meninda Bogle, and I am a business development and innovation manager at the Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust. And you probably heard about the innovation pop-up yesterday, so that's primarily where I work. So effectively, we take a 3-pronged approach, and that is, first of all, identifying what the unmet needs are across our organization, so a sort of unmet needs audit. We then look internally towards our staff, trying to develop a culture of innovation and really trying to stimulate that sort of thinking amongst our staff. And then, of course, we also look externally into the market. So what sort of technological solutions are out there? So you guys, I guess, and really trying to align those solutions with those unmet needs. So we get those people together and start that conversation in order to see whether we can bring that technology and ultimately adopt that technology into the trust. Now, of course, that is not straightforward. And part of our work at the Innovation Pop-Up is to really, if you like, stress test our organization, really push at all the doors and see where those barriers are and try and understand how we can then, of course, overcome them. So really looking forward to the discussion.
Introductions, Chris. The late Chris McKee is here.
Hello, everyone. Apologies for being late. I didn't realize there was a change to the agenda. So I'm Chris. I am Managing Director for the UK for a company called Better Medicine. And I've also launched the subsidiary arm, Better Medicine UK, here in Leeds, in Nexus. So my role there is to manage all of their activities here in this country, engaging with the NHS and a range of different stakeholders, also working with the Trust here in Leeds, and also supporting them on most of their international activities. From my background, though, I did actually used to do what Meninda does with the team. So I used to be in the NHS doing business development and innovation. So I have seen both sides of the fence. I understand the frustrations from both sides. I think that is quite advantageous in many ways to know where some of the positives are, but also where some of the negatives are, and how maybe we can overcome them, or perhaps not, which I'm sure we'll talk about a lot more today. So thank you for having me.
Thanks, guys. That's great. So we've got someone who works in a health tech consultancy, but also an entrepreneur. We've got Meninda, who's working, I guess, close to the front line in the hospital with clinicians, nurses, AHPs, et cetera, and we've got an innovator at the end who's been on both sides of the fence. So we've got a really interesting panel here, and I guess the first question that I'm going to ask the panel individually to answer is to maybe think about some of the experiences you've had that have been positive about driving technology into NHS organisations, making a difference for patients, and getting helping companies succeed and grow. So we'll start off with some positive reflections on how barriers have been identified and overcome. I think that'd be a good way to maybe start off the discussion. Anne, I'll come to you first.
Thank you. So I'll give a practical example, as you said. So we worked with, actually it was an NHS clinician, or a group of clinicians within a relatively small district general hospital, so not one of the glamorous parts of the NHS, but a very entrepreneurial group who are serial inventors, and they had developed a technology called Saphira, safer injection of regional anaesthesia. It's technology that's been around for a few years now, and it went on a relatively well-trodden path of initially doing a pilot within the hospital where the innovators had developed it, then working with the local HIN, as I should now call them, within the east of England to do essentially a 10 hospital pilot study in order to generate sufficient evidence that this new method of doing regional blocks was safer, cost-effective, and was something that clinicians wanted and needed. So really making sure that you could validate the need for the solution and that you could provide the evidence required around cost-effectiveness and safety. And that technology has now gone on to be rapidly adopted, particularly overseas. It's now on market in the US, in the Middle East, in Australasia, in Germany, France, Italy, Spain. I have to say adoption in the NHS, despite being an NHS-invented technology, has still been slow, but is beginning to pick up. So I think a good example, perhaps, of tapping into some of the initial networks and facilitators within the UK to get the evidence required to go to market. Getting adoption at scale in the NHS, I think, is something that still remains challenging for innovators. But
I think most of the room would probably agree with that, Anne, as well. But there is something really, I think, something on offer in the NHS about that evidence base and being able to do that work to really establish that something works effectively. It's a tough market. If you can do it here, that still has value, doesn't it? So I think that's useful. I do know the Medivate guys quite well, and I've seen them demonstrate many times. Meninda, from inside the trust, you're bringing stuff in. Your clinicians want to innovate. That's my view from the outside. How are you helping them, and what barriers are you helping companies overcome to make that happen in Leeds?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I suppose to answer that, I'll take a company, a new startup called New Health, and they're in the domain of helping dementia patients. So we came across New Health through a number of methods, actually. One of them was Propel, actually, but one of them was also the Clinical Insights Program. And of course, what happens is we get to hear their value proposition, and then we take that to clinicians within the trust, and we ask the question, do you think this is helpful? Could this help your practice and help you deliver services better? And actually, immediately, we got traction with this particular software as a medical device. And so once the clinicians are on board and they can see that it's going to help their practice, then that's a huge barrier to overcome. And then we start to get some sort of momentum in place. So of course, we still have to get through our internal sort of structures and mechanisms. And we were able to go to our information governance and make the case that this is clearly key. Now, they obviously push back. There are all these other issues that you need to resolve. One of them was, for example, it'll fragment the patient record, that you'll have information over here in the EHR, but you'll have information over here in the software. And that might open the trust to liability, for example. So, but we were able to argue the case that that probably was a very, very low risk and get IG approval. That now is in place and working. We're starting to recruit patients to that small pilot study that we're doing. But already people are very excited about that. I think that could be potentially transformational.
And thanks, Melinda. I think that's a really good example of it's vital to get the clinical buy-in, but the rest of the organisation needs to join the party as well. And I think information governance out there, I'm sure many people in the room roll their eyes slightly when they hear DTAC or DPIA or information governance. It is out there, it needs to be done. And I think, we're quite lucky in LTHT. We've got a team of people like yourselves, Melinda, in the pop-up as an umbrella term for the support network around the rest of the organisation to get some of these things done, because it is challenging and difficult, but you can't do it on your own. So that's really helpful.
And just to come back to you, New Health are particularly impressive. They understand what that regulatory sort of landscape looks like, what questions that our IG team are going to ask them, and they were very prepared. And so that's quite impressive. And that does help to persuade IG that these guys know what they're talking about, and it sort of lowers the risk.
Yeah, well prepared.
Yeah.
Chris, you're an innovator. Is this chiming? I mean, you must have challenges every day.
Yes, to say the least. I'm almost rubbing my hands together, waiting for that question. There are a lot of challenges for innovators, particularly industry partners, to engage with the NHS. We could spend a lot of time talking about a range of them. I know that you've highlighted restrictions with IG, the DTAC process, which some would argue actually that perhaps it isn't as necessary, but others would say otherwise. But I think for me, from my experience on both sides of the fence, I think a lot of these people are actually doing good work and necessary work. The frustrations almost comes in the underlying processes behind them for me. And I had a good conversation this morning with a couple of individuals in the audience about this, that these teams are not necessarily utilizing some of the tools that are available perhaps in other industries which could help them with these processes. So I used to work in sort of quality assurance in a very large CRO, contract research organization, and a lot of it was around GMP and GXP practices. I think there's a lot of learning that the NHS could adopt from those areas whereby they could streamline some of these processes. A big issue for me, working with a few different trusts, has been around data access. And it's not because the process of data, or at least the bits you're writing about data access and wanting approval for are incorrect. It's the fact that there's a lack of maybe continuity between people within the same team, a lack of recording of activities that have been done. To me, a lot of it should be a tick box exercise almost, which is what you kind of do in a GMP setting. You're kind of going through the quality assurance processes. You're saying done, 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 done. And then you don't have to go back to it unless something really goes particularly wrong. And then you have things like CAPAs in place. You have deviation rules in place so that you can cover it. But a lot of these trusts aren't utilizing these tools. They're perhaps not utilizing some of the effective project management tools as well, which allows for that cross-team communication so that you don't have to kind of go sometimes in circles. So that's been the biggest frustration for me as an innovator, but also within the system of trying to bypass some of these things. I know that NHS England is trying to address some of these things and addressing some of the putting forward some minimum standards for this. But I still feel like individual trusts are going to add a lot of layers on top of that. And they don't need to. I think a lot of these companies are coming, when they're heavily regulated, which they are, when they have ISO accreditations in place, which many of them do, when they have DTAC in place, they've done a lot of the groundwork for this. And we should trust that to some extent. allow it to kind of get through certain stages so that you can focus on what matters for you at a trust level. And then perhaps we can reduce maybe that 6-month turnaround time to 3 months. And for companies, honestly, 6 months is a huge amount of time in terms of their move towards revenue generation, towards convincing their investors. These are things we need to take hand in hand. I think that this is possible, and I think that's what we should consider for the near future.
Thanks, Chris. And Anne, with your consultancy hat on, I suppose, in a sense, you're probably working with industry partners out there as well who want some of these barriers to be overcome as quickly and as easily as possible. What's your feeling about what we could be doing better as a system? And I mean the whole system, innovators as well as the NHS. You know, everyone's got to come to the party.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, we've talked a lot about the barriers throughout the course of the 2 days, and indeed PDM had a nice little survey going out there on their stand, and you could see all of the kind of the words that you would expect to be popping up around, you know, funding, regulation, governance, all of the things that you've got to overcome, really. But I think there's a couple of things that we sometimes don't think about as innovators so much as when we're in the product development phase, we're often very focused on the technology. And we often don't think enough about selling a solution. And what I mean by that is thinking about, you know, it's not just the cost of the technology, it's the cost of implementation. It's the education and training that might be required to retrain staff to use a new technology. It's thinking about, the previous speakers mentioned the pathway and what the impact of our technology is on a pathway. And really understanding what does the NHS currently do to solve this problem, and how might that change by the introduction of a point-of-care diagnostic or a new digital health app or a wearable technology or whatever it might be. So I think as innovators we perhaps need to not just focus on our technology, it's clearly very important, but by the time we start to engage in discussions with commissioners in particular, they sort of take as read that the technology will do what it says on the tin. They're kind of much more interested in, well, you know, what are the benefits? You know, how am I actually going to realize these benefits? And I think, you know, when we talk about cost savings, for example, and this was touched on a little bit in the health economics session earlier, you know, it's not just about cash release and savings. Actually, a much more important KPI for a hospital trust or for commissioners might be getting their waiting list down. Or it may be some other benefit that actually they're more interested in than pure cost saving, because the cost saving may not even accrue to them. It may accrue to another part of the system. So I think as innovators, you know, we do kind of need to be all-rounders. We can't just be coders and developers and engineers. You know, we've got to think about the whole. We've got to think about the whole pathway, and we've got to think about generating evidence across the piece and really coming with solutions and trying to work with and co-design as much as we can, clinicians, organisations and commissioners. And that means, you know, coming to events such as today and meeting the kind of people that you need to be able to network with to help you fill some of these evidence gaps.
Thank you very much, Anne. That's really helpful. And picking up on your theme on pathway, point of care I always find a little bit misleading because it's a point in a pathway, and there's ripples upstream and downstream of the pathway. I mean, you're working in a secondary care setting. Innovation coming into you often will have implications in primary care or community. How do you, in the hospital, think about pathway, not just in your organisation, but what happens to patients when they leave as well after they've maybe received the benefits of an innovation?
That's a great question. And well, it's a broad and big question, isn't it? I suppose just picking up on, you know, what Anne was saying is that, so we in the Innovation Pop-Up, we don't do procurement. What we're trying to do is put our innovators in the best position, i.e. to generate the right evidence, the right knowledge base, to then persuade the commissioners, the people who make the decision, that this is useful. So in terms of designing what that pilot study might then look like, it's really to address those questions. So what happens upstream and what happens downstream, and can we sort of collect some metrics and perhaps quantify that to some degree? That's the well-designed pilot study. So it is a really difficult question because, you know, secondary care looks after its budgets. That's the main driver for what we're trying to do. It doesn't often look beyond that to what might then happen. It should do, of course. And I think we're starting to think a little bit more as we talk about innovation and these sorts of issues about how the whole thing should be working together. But in my experience, there's not a lot of that that's sort of going on. Certainly not in the conversations that I'm perhaps having. But that doesn't mean that's representative. I have to add that.
Yeah, and I think you're after a lot of quite sort of high-value innovation, particularly in the pop-up as well. I think an observation might be that the establishment of the ICBs over the last couple of years is trying to address some of those challenges. And maybe Chris, from the innovator perspective, in terms of thinking about where your innovation fits in the overall pathway of a patient journey, is that something that you spend a lot of time thinking about as well, depending on who you're talking to?
Yes, definitely. I mean, this may also come from my own experience, bringing my own experiences within the NHS to the table, but I think all companies need to address this underlying wider message. So a lot of companies tend to focus on the problem that they're trying to solve, and they get excited about that one particular area, and they don't necessarily think about the wider implications. What is your sustainability message? What is your net zero message? There's been a lot of discussion at this conference about that. What is your impact upstream and downstream? You're more likely to succeed, from my experience, of looking at your impact on workforce and workflow efficiencies than you are necessarily on having the greatest diagnostic solution for one problem or another. If you can put your messaging in aligned to that and how it impacts the workforce, you're going to have a better time of it. You're going to speak the languages of the ICBs. You're going to speak the languages of the trusts themselves. You have to work with health economists in this country. There's no doubt about it. There's extreme amount of positive value working with them because they can look at where you're going to have the greatest impact with your technology, which might not be where you initially thought it was. And these are things that companies do have to come to this country, especially if you're an international company, and be ready to bring that to the table, to build it into your company strategy. We are doing that. The company I work for is actually an Estonian company, but it's learnt enough about the UK, and I know enough about the UK to know we need these things. So it's a really big part of our daily activities and discussions, and it's the only way we can properly sell ourselves to people beyond just the message of, we have an amazing technology that solves problem X.
Said every innovator, everywhere, all the time. And I think that's another important point. There's so much innovation out there as well. How do you get the airtime of the people that you want in the system as well? And I think it's evidence and evaluation and proof that really helps differentiate, I think, some of those conversations. So maybe just picking up on what good evidence and evaluation looks like. And I don't know if we've talked much about NICE over the last day or two as well. It's a very high bar for evidence at NICE, but some really strong positives if you go through that process. And have you had much experience of bringing businesses to and through any processes at NICE, or what would be your views on doing that?
Yeah, I mean, we talked about that a little bit earlier, and I think the resources at NICE mean that they don't do as many medical technology appraisals as obviously they do with drugs, and the funding mandate isn't in place in quite the same way for medical devices either, and so certainly a lot of the innovators that we work with think long and hard about going through a NICE technology appraisal. First of all, you have to be selected, and that means you need to sit within quite specific priority areas. And then if you do fit those criteria, even if you do get a positive appraisal, having paid over a certain amount of money, it doesn't necessarily mean that your innovation will then be reimbursed, that anyone will actually still buy the innovation. So I think a lot of our innovators think quite hard about whether the NICE processes are right for them. I know the new call that came out around real-world evidence, I think, is quite an exciting programme, which is obviously looking at over 2 to 3 years, being able to collect sort of real-world evidence of the impact of innovations, which is probably much more appropriate for medical devices than RCTs, which, you know, in many cases are just too expensive, take too long, and by the time you get to the end of them, you've probably changed your device or your technology anyway, and that evidence is no longer relevant. So I think the use of real-world evidence is potentially important within the UK marketplace, certainly for medical device manufacturers. So I'd like to see more of that, and I think that's something that the HRCs also developing essentially practical tools for medtech innovators to be able to use to develop their evidence base, understand what data do we need to collect, and then have some sort of assurance process, some sort of light touch, nice process that allows the commissioners, who aren't themselves health economists, they're not technology experts, and for them, you know, there are a lot of medical devices on market, there's a lot of digital technologies on market, and they're not experts in understanding what does good look like in terms of evidence. And so we need to help them, and the HRCs and everyone working within the innovation landscape, including NICE and the HINs, you know, we need to develop some tools to help our innovators develop good quality evidence that commissioners can have trust in, because that's what will accelerate adoption.
Chris, I see you nodding at the end. Did you want to come in on that at all in terms of, I'm not saying you should be going to NICE, but some of those considerations for companies are very, very pertinent, aren't they, about whether you decide to go down that route or not?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I started to change my mind since I've changed roles. When I was in the NHS, I pushed a little bit more towards having NICE approval, but having experienced it on the other side, I think you've really got to decide whether you want to go down that path or not, or whether you're going to be wasting your time a little bit, because technically they are guidelines, they're not necessarily rules. I think people forget that sometimes. I think we work in AI, diagnostic imaging in radiology, and NICE hasn't actually been that nice to AI diagnostic imaging companies recently. They published a paper last year, particularly around lung AIs, and it was a bit damning, if I'm being honest, and I think Aidence took the brunt of that because they were the first of the four. And so it actually got in their way. And realistically, I think their technology is pretty superb, and people are going to carry on with them anyway. But it has put a bit of a dampener on their progress, and ultimately led to them being absorbed into another company. So for us, our question is, well, do we want to go down the NICE route on our own, or are we ultimately just going to end up getting assessed by them anyway as part of a wider assessment? And sometimes, depending on your technology, then you might as well just leave it to fate, but learn from the past lessons. So at the moment, the greatest benefit we're getting from it is to look at, well, what was lacking with those previous innovations and solutions? What did NICE kick off about? Rightly so. And how can we then do our RWEs and our own studies with those factors in mind? And then one day, when NICE does look at the wider picture, then we've kind of, hopefully, made the cut. But it is a very big decision for any commercial company, and it's not a small one by any means. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes on making that decision.
Thanks, Chris. And Maninder, I'll come to you, maybe not so much on NICE, but on that evidence generation piece within the trust. How important is that to you to work in partnership with innovators to generate the wide breadth of evidence that you need to make that decision about moving forward from pilot to a product that you procure?
Well, it's critical, because you've got to make a robust and powerful and evidence-based case, okay? So that is a requirement. I suppose there's a couple of things. I mean, I don't really have very much to do with NICE, so I won't really comment on that, except that companies come to us saying that they've had, you know, an assessment they've been recommended, for example, thinking that that's going to carry quite a lot of weight when it comes to adoption, maybe, within the trust. It doesn't. What it does, it opens some doors, for example. It pricks interest in some clinicians, for example. But what is necessary is evidence generation in our setting. And that actually begs a bigger question, and that is, once that evidence generation has been done, and we are happy with it, does that mean then we get adoption across the system? Well, actually, no, it doesn't, because those companies we hear again and again and again go to another trust and they say, we need you to generate the evidence here, in this setting. So I think that's a really important issue that the NHS has to try and address. Evidence generation once, for companies, because that's expensive, and then a wider adoption on that. I know the Clinical Insights Programme has tried to address that by having this sort of passport mechanism where, you look at all the bits of evidence and what you need from trusts and then create a sort of tick box that you can then, adhere to. Something similar to what Chris was talking about earlier in terms of IG governance. But yeah, I think that's a really, really big issue that we need to solve as a system.
Okay, we'll maybe come back to that in a bit. Now, I'm going to come to the audience for questions in a minute. I'm going to ask one or two more around implementation. But I'm going to come out to the audience in a few minutes for questions, so get your thinking caps on. So again, Chris, I'm going to start with you at the end. The implementation challenge, it gets a little bit to what Meninda was talking about, the not invented here syndrome, and we need more evidence here. And one of the things that we've seen as an organisation is a really good implementation plan can help mitigate some of those conversations. So it's not about people in the NHS usually believe it works, but like Anne said, the time it gets there, we believe it, but can we make it work in our system? So implementation, evidencing implementation, and then using that to bring to your next customer. What's your experience of how important that is?
I have so just to make it clear, our company's at the stage where actually implementation with the NHS has not occurred yet. But from my experience of this, more broadly, I think your first almost demo site is key to this. That partner who really is pulling you, I should say, as much as you're pushing them, in order to want to work with them, who want to go through the kerfuffle of integrations within their systems, whether that's PACS, EHR, RIS, whatever, the ones who want to actually take the time to essentially integrate and implement you within their systems to show that it's working. That's the way to go. And realistically, you're not going to get a huge number of those sites at the same time. Probably not unless those sites are being forced to do it by a bigger entity, and it's like you have to do a large-scale procurement. That's not going to happen. So, from my experience, the benefits from doing that come from the fact that you have a lot to learn in these integration processes. It's never that easy. I will always say in my pitch, we will integrate with you seamlessly, but the process is not necessarily that seamless. It might even be from our side, but it wouldn't be from the other side. So being able to try and test these things out with particular sites who want to do this with you is vital. And then you've learnt those lessons and you can go in essentially with a full story about how you've been implemented, how you've been integrated, what is your business case, because this is a big part of procurement, even before you get to integration in some cases. You can then take that model and then apply it to the next place. The more broad you can make that, because we have to remember not everyone's on the same EHR, we don't use the same PAC systems across the board like they do in Scotland, you have to make sure that you can address that question as well. Well, you did it in that. You did it in Leeds' own home-built EHR, but can you actually do it in this? Yes, you can, and prepare yourself for those questions, because a lot of those processes are actually quite similar. And I think you will have a better time of it. I'm hoping we'll have a better time of it once we've proven it on our side. And I think the companies that have a good strategy around that and have appropriate documentation in place for that can convince minds a lot quicker than those that don't. But it is a bit chicken and egg in terms of where you are in the stage.
And from your perspective, both as an innovator and in that consultancy role, implementation plans, how much time do you spend talking to your customers about that?
A lot. And I completely agree. I think transparency is really important. I think if you go in and say, this will be seamless, there'll be no problems here whatsoever, they probably won't believe you. So I think being able to use those first pilot sites, however many that you have, and being able to say, look, we did have a few problems, but here's what we learned, and we can now use these learnings to make this process better for you. So you get the advantage of kind of learning from the mistakes we made the first time around. And I think trust is a word we probably don't use enough, but I think that it's, selling is of a medical device is about relationship building, and you have to build trust with your customer. You're not selling toilet rolls or used cars. You're selling a device that's going to be used in patients or by patients or clinicians. And so, there needs to be transparency around the data, transparency around the challenges, and then you can start to build trust. And I think if you can, get that open conversation with them and help them to understand, that you've learned from whatever mistakes you might have made the first time around, then it can definitely accelerate that process of not having to write 200 business cases for each and every hospital that you go and talk to, because we know how time-consuming and expensive that is.
Meninda, from the inside.
So integration is very, very difficult. Our DIT department at the Leeds Teaching Hospital Trust does an amazing job just keeping the whole operation going. So asking them to do anything additional requires more staff, and that generally means sort of consultancy staff for us. We recently embarked on a sort of digital data project with a company called Flatiron, and that's now ongoing, but in its initial stages, our DIT department were asking the company something in the region of £350,000 because of consultancy fees, just to tell the company what needed to be done, i.e. a business analyst, a solutions architect, etc., and all those skills that are needed to determine what that integration might look like. That is prohibitively expensive. So we've got a lot of work to do when it comes to DIT and integration, because the NHS is competing with the private sector for these skills and these resources, which means that what happens is that these staff come in, they work, but then they go into the private sector because they can earn substantially more money. And that leaves the NHS in a very difficult position. So how do we manage that? That's something that we're going to have to look at. We have managed to get that project off the ground, I have to say. So we have managed to solve it. So there is ways forward, but it's not straightforward.
Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. So that's a little bit on implementation. Have we got any questions from the floor? I'm going to pick on people. You've been warned. Ben.
That's stressful. Right, what was I going to say? So I think there's a theme that's come through in a lot of the answers, but maybe hasn't been sort of explicitly mentioned. So I heard a really good quote yesterday, actually, about healthcare moves at the speed of trust. And you've all touched on, you need to understand the pathway, you need to know the use case, you need to have a clinical champion. So what can the NHS do to enable innovators and companies to access that expertise and that knowledge and build those relationships quicker? And so it's a question for Meninda, but then also, I guess, from the other two, from the outside, what would you like to see the NHS doing?
Well, I'd like to see more Menindas across other trusts. But Meninda, I'll come to you first and talk a little bit about what you've done specifically in LTHT to address this.
So actually, I'm going to address the broader question first, if that's okay. And I think that what would be a brilliant enabler is some small funding. So sort of clinicians have the ability to do research and have funding separately for that. And that's been brilliant in terms of driving research activity across the trust. I think we need something similar for innovation. Now, it doesn't have to be to the same extent. It can be competitive because we have to also recognize that there are natural innovators within the trust, within our staff, and a competitive type process where you sort of apply to gain some funding in order to take you out of your day job for a little bit of time so that you can then focus on a particular innovation. I think that would unlock a huge amount of sort of intellectual and experiential capital that sits in our trust.
Yeah, that's good. I'll come to you, Chris, as well. I was just going to warn many of our NIHR colleagues in the room who are sitting on oodles of money, what their thoughts are. So I'll maybe come to them in a moment. But Chris, you first.
A couple of points. So the first one, to completely reinforce what Melinda said, I think the most powerful tool that people can bring to the table from the NIHR or the NHS side is the pump prime funding. That has always got projects off the ground. It's always competitive, really, or at least it's heavily vetted. So you're not just giving money to anyone. But it's such an important factor in getting things off the ground. We really want to do this project. We don't have any money. Okay, well, we're going to have to get money. Oh, you don't have enough evidence yet. It's a vicious cycle. If there's 10, even just 10K can actually get something going. Some projects that we're doing, we've put a little bit of money to the side, so some companies can afford to do a bit of pump priming, but it really shouldn't always be that way around. And there have been some good initiatives around that. There needs to be more, and the money needs to be given to the trusts, and they should be trusted with it to make those decisions so that they can bring things through. So 100% supportive for that. The second thing I wanted to highlight was for the company side of this, to help them understand some of the issues, is that you kind of have to go where the energy is. You are shopping around a lot, and if you are finding that you're going to sites that aren't really responding to you, you're having to do a lot of chasing up, and you're not really getting anywhere, you can be really dragged along for quite a number of months. So I actually would recommend to those companies to actually feel out almost the energy in a way for what's going on with who you're working with. How much are they actually talking to you? Are they talking about next steps, or are they just ticking a box? And this is something that actually the NHS can take on board as well, is that if you're bringing that sort of positive drive to work with these companies to the table, it's then reflected from the company side and then wanting to work with you, and it kind of goes hand in hand. So I think all of these things could be taken on board and create quite a lot of benefit.
Thanks, Chris. I think you're saying a quick no is as valuable.
Yeah, it really is.
As a quick
yes.
yes.
Definitely.
Yeah. Anne, have anything to add to that?
I think the only thing I would add is we can often find clinicians who are kind of ready, willing and able to collaborate with industry, and we can often find sources of funding as well. We had an ERDF programme where we gave out grants to SMEs who were looking to get some clinical insights. And that program was quite successful, except in a number of cases where the clinician was willing, the SME was willing, we had the funding in place, but could we find someone within the hospital who was willing to sign off on the collaboration agreement? So I think we often, forget about the kind of legal and kind of contract skills, I guess, and kind of lining up or even getting finance to send you an invoice so that you can actually get the collaboration underway. So I think, it's that infrastructure. It's not just finding willing clinicians. It's actually getting someone in the R&D team to sign off on the collaboration agreement, even when the funding is in place. So I think, that's something that the NHS could get perhaps a little bit better at, is, doing that in a timely fashion.
So we definitely recognise that, and so part of the work that we do is just test the system, and we realise that actually it's very ad hoc, and actually the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, even though they're addressing the same issue. So I suppose one thing I would say is that we are trying to work out what the best mechanisms are so that we are consistent, to create a sort of map for people who want to interact with us, so it makes it as straightforward as possible, that they can be as prepared as possible. So that's ongoing work, but we have to find out first what is going on in our own sort of system before we can create that.
And a known unknown is better than an unknown unknown. So well done, Melinda. So I think we're going to come to Marcus, and I think John wants a question here at the front as well. Marcus.
Yeah, hi, John. Yeah, just a quick plug. Marcus Orton I'm working with Innovate UK on the source of the 10 grand of funding. The Innovate UK Business Growth Service has an RTO scheme, and certainly that can fund work with the Health Innovation Network now and various other agencies, and the NHS trusts are also on the list of agencies that can be funded. So that might be another motivation to encourage people to say. Another observation was having good case studies to illustrate to other people how this is working. It could be useful to show people, right, this is what we've done, and this is something that we could get better at, is how we share the good news of the progress that we're making. My question, because of the work that I'm doing, the AHS, the Health Innovation Network, and the HRC, if I'm getting the acronyms right, we're all working with quite a large number of businesses. And much of the conversation today, and often has been, around how individual companies, organisations, can work through this process. To what extent can we do more to encourage these individual organisations to work together, especially where the individual organisations may be tackling a part of the care pathway, and their combined contributions may contribute to a greater, sort of an earlier or more comprehensive impact to that care pathway, and that those companies may individually bring strengths and weaknesses of finance or health economics to each other, as well as to the argument, the business case that they're putting forward.
You passed the mic very quickly there, Majid.
Yes, so I've been thinking this for some time, and I think I can do this from two different perspectives. I think, and in terms of from the NHS side and maybe academic institution side, I used to work under a chap actually called Mike Messenger, who was interested in this idea of having almost like a platform through which technologies could be embedded at different stages of the pipeline. I think it's a grand idea, but there are ways of maybe doing that where and I think more NHS institutions are thinking of doing this, where they're looking at a bigger picture, where companies can go in as a group, address different parts of an underlying problem, and benefit as a whole. That is something I do want to see more of, for either if it's from the NIHR or if it's from the NHS institutions. I think they did something quite well in along those lines during COVID. We can do it. We can. So we should do it. That's one side. On the other side, I mean, I work in the AI field, and actually a lot of us are already doing that. We're working as platforms. I think our most successful route to revenue is going to be embedding ourselves in a platform provider, and we're going to go in as part of a bigger offering. It's just going to be quicker, and our evidence can come as a cohort. You might not even know that we're there because our brand is hidden somewhere underneath. But I think more and more companies are going in as themselves as a B2B platform offering, which can then be presented to trust. It depends on the technology that's being put there. Not everyone can do that, but I am seeing it more. But I think it needs to come from both sides, basically.
Thanks, Chris. Anybody else want to add to that?
Just from our point of view, we work very closely with the WYAT Trust, the West Yorkshire Acute something Trust. Yeah, thank you. But we meet with them regularly to sort of share best practice, and so actually create this kind of larger kind of platform, I suppose. It would be the equivalent for companies to come and share with.
Yeah, and that works very, very well in procurement, and it's how we leverage that for innovation as well as kind of the next step. So that's a good point.
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think, what we need is a bit more leadership around, really trying to coalesce some of the learnings and focusing on specific sort of pathways. And I think there are some good examples out there. So in the women's health field, the Royal College of Gynecologists held an event the other week there for International Women's Day. and brought in a number of technologies within women's health, obviously an area, bit of hobby horse on mine, excuse me, while I disappear off on my hobby horse, an underfunded area, and one that's got a bit more emphasis around it now. And they're looking actually at developing an accelerator where they can actually help companies with technologies relevant to women's health, help them to actually navigate some of these many difficult processes and perhaps accelerate their adoption more at scale by coming from that sort of one step away from the front line, if you like, but clearly, with an important and influential and an organisation that can play a leadership role within that particular sector. So I think, those types of initiatives are the sorts of things that we would like to see more of. And I think the HRCs, I sat on the interview panel for the HRCs and for the Network Coordinating Centre, which I don't think has been announced yet, so I won't say who it is. But I think that's got a really important role in terms of providing leadership across the 14 HRCs and really, taking those learnings and making sure that things are actually spread across the country. And we don't just have, some excellent things going on in Leeds and some excellent things going on in Cambridge and excellent things going on in Newcastle, but we don't get, the sum of the parts of all of that learning. So I think there are some positive signs in terms of the leadership coming from different types of organisations.
Again, I guess the Innovation Ecosystem Review is live at the moment as we speak. And we'll have to see what emerges out of that, but hopefully some of these themes will emerge there as well. So I've got a question at the front here. John, introduce yourself.
So I'm John Neighbour. I'm the CEO of Eventum Orthopedics. We're a Northern powerhouse-based startup based in Leeds. And really, the comment you made triggered, I just had to ask the question. And they say feedback's a gift. So, so we're in our launch phase in the UK, and I think you said something like you end up going to random places. Well, last Sunday we drove to Guildford because we're doing cases in Guildford. We're going to go to Oswestry. Actually, Sunday we're driving down to Exeter, which is one of the lead orthopaedic centres in the country. We're targeting Wrightington. We've got surgeons in Leeds who want to use our technology, and we just don't seem to get through the barrier of process to get to the stage where they can bring the technology in. So we're clearly, and I think it's, because I've known Leeds Centre for quite a long time, I think it's because probably the centres that we're getting pulled into are, highly academic centres where the profs are, very well published and so forth. And I would probably, Chapel Allerton is a high volume joint centre. And that might be the problem, but I'm sat in the audience going, you're 2 miles away. How do we get our technology, which is innovative, it solves a problem? We've actually got NHS Innovation Service approval, and we're going to go through the tendering process for NHS Innovation, but we're clearly doing something wrong. Help.
Oh, Meninda, I think that's one for you, the challenge of Chapel Allerton.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's no easy answers here. Obviously, we've got some fantastic orthopaedic surgeons. Hemant Pandit was here yesterday, as you know. Ultimately, the evidence, and the outcomes will sell them your technology. The way I always see it, it's the data. I've got a scientific background, right? So evidence, data. Now, even if we're clinical academics, then that's the thing that's going to speak the loudest. Now, if you have the evidence, then it's an easy case to make, then, isn't it? What we do is help you make that case to those clinicians. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, but I suppose that's how I would go and talk to Hemant Pandit, for example, or whoever it is.
So we have clinician buy-in. And if the clinicians were the decision makers, and typically in the centres who are successful, the clinicians are buying into our value proposition and driving it through the process. But it's actually the process beyond the clinician buy-in that we that's just things fall down. I don't know if that's resonating, but that's what I often see.
I think, I mean, Chris is going to come in a minute as well. I mean, I think from a health innovation network perspective, that does resonate, and it's a challenge all across the NHS with all innovators everywhere. And I think, we can't just let clinicians make all the decisions either. It's a team game, isn't it? And there's something about the team and the team's capacity to do how much innovation can any team do in any one day, any one week. So I think it's a very complex challenge, that as well. Incredibly frustrating. Exeter's an awful long way away, and that's a lot of road miles. But you do sometimes find yourself going where the energy is as well, don't you? So I think there's maybe an offline conversation to be had. But I think it's a problem many people in the room, I think, will recognise, John, and you're right to raise it, because there is no magic wand either.
You almost need a very engaged clinician and a very progressive purchasing and senior management department, and then if those two things go together.
You mean in the companies or the NHS?
In the hospital, in the trust. If that exists in the trust, I think you can succeed. But unfortunately, those two things are a little bit randomly scattered.
They can be, but they can happen as well. So I'm going to
Can I just quickly come back on that?
and then we'll go to Chris.
So I suppose, again, as an innovation pop-up, what we're trying to do is understand what these barriers are. What is holding you up? So I don't really know, as you could tell, but what I'm prepared to do and what we do as a team is try and go in there and understand what process is inhibiting you and what we can then do to try and solve that. That's what we can drive forward.
Thank you. John, I'm really glad you brought that up. And that I didn't bring it up because I guess I would sound a bit different from up here. But you said, what are we doing wrong from your perspective? My view is that you're not doing anything wrong necessarily. I think a lot of companies aren't necessarily doing anything wrong there. They're just banging on a door that's not necessarily open for them. And this is why I said that phrase again, going where the energy is, which is what you've done. You've had to travel a bloody long way to do it, but you're going where you're finding success. Having the clinicians buy in is a big part of the story. It's not enough if people aren't there to support you and get you there. What I would say is and maybe my old team are going to hate me a little bit for this, but when I was in that position where I could support those things, there was some cases where I would when I was on the inside, I would bypass some of those systems to an extent. Or I would go higher up the rankings. I mean, if you really have to, I don't routinely do this, but if the CEO has to get on board because your technology really is genuinely that beneficial, then sometimes they can influence that decision as well. So if you are in the position where you do have that much buy-in, maybe you can hijack the system a little bit to an extent where you can kind of go one layer above, and find a way to have that conversation, and then make it come back down. And I have seen that happen in some instances with some companies who've been able to get buy-in a little bit higher, and then it feeds back down the system. And it's because it's been clinically led. It's tough though. It is tough, and this is why you will find some institutions are just going to be more successful for you than others, and it is random. Some people will have the greatest luck in the world and the greatest progress in the world working with leads. Others will not. But I am glad you brought it to the table, because it's a really valid point.
There speaks the gamekeeper turned poacher.
A little bit.
Okay, any more questions from the room or observations? Ian, thank you. I was going to come to you. Yeah. Let us know who you are, Ian, as well.
So, Ian Newington, Assistant Director Innovations at NIHR, IFRI Programme team. I thought I'd better get in before you pounced on me. And I'm kind of I wanted to kind of throw something slightly back to you guys as well. Is anyone aware of the Zinc accelerator and their model? Because so one of the questions is, and you've seen this. I'll tell you how they work in a minute. Because you've been on our committees. We still get too many people applying to us who's got this great idea, and it's almost like it's an idea looking for a solution, looking for a problem. What I would like to do is to see people solving a real problem. and coming together. So it kind of links into the previous question about actually sometimes it's also point solutions to problems, and you need to bring a few of those together. That's another issue, and I've got some thoughts around doing something about that with our portfolio. The Zinc Accelerator do something quite different. I haven't seen this before. What they do is they don't get companies that have got their technologies and put them through a process to help them to get to be better companies and hopefully sell their technology. What they do is they get really good people, and they actually who've got issues or got concerns and expertise around a particular problem, whatever that happens to be for this particular year. This year they're talking about sustainability. And then they put them through some processes, and they bring some people in, and then they create companies or small groups of people to actually address particular problems. They bring them together, and they actually create companies out of that accelerator, and then continue to help them along. So they're actually creating companies to solve particular problems that they've identified and bringing them together, rather than bringing someone with a great idea and trying to teach them how to do it better. So I'm just kind of the question I'm going to, because this is a question that the Health Innovation Networks are supposed to be helping us with, is how do we find the right problems for people to be working on? How do people know that the problems they're working on, which then they're going to come to us for some money for, are really the right problems? Because we need to know that, and sometimes we don't. I know you've sat on our panels, Nev, and you've sometimes said this is just not going to work, and that's absolutely really valuable.
Out loud, Ian.
You have. It's really good. It's really important and valuable. That's why we got you on the panel. But it would be good if we didn't have to worry about that. It'd be good if the things that we got to see, we were more worried about how good the application was, because they're really already solving a problem which is really, really an important one.
Thanks, Ian. I mean, I'll take that on a little bit myself and then come to the panel. I mean, I think, we're here today because of the HRC. And if I think of bits of infrastructure up and down the country that de-risk things that are coming across my desk, whether I'm reviewing a grant or sitting in my role in the Health Innovation Network, what you're looking for are businesses and people who have worked with bits of the infrastructure that are quite close to the front line. So whether it's the pop-up or whether it's a HRC or some other bit of the infrastructure that's available to us in the country, those are things that because they're often sense checking that the solution is actually solving a real problem that is not just in one place but across the whole of the system. So that's certainly one of the things that I would look for in terms of really understanding whether the solution is addressing a real problem across the NHS. I'll come to the panel for any other thoughts as well.
I suppose from the innovation pop-up perspective, what we encourage innovators to do is come to us early and have that discussion with us about what problem they're solving and whether it is actually a real unmet need or not. And that means sort of initiating those conversations with our staff, clinicians, or it could be that it's estates or wherever it is in the trust, in order to address that very problem. And of course, there's obviously the clinical insights program. A lot of those kind of innovators are clinicians that have come out of the system because they've seen a real need and are trying to develop that. So that also slightly addresses the comment that you made.
To back up, actually, because I'm remembering my days when I worked alongside Meninda and the team. There were a few interesting initiatives coming out of R&I at Leeds, which could be replicated. So, for example, last year as well, they undertook the second round of what was called a healthcare entrepreneur exchange program. These were individuals who were quite heavily vetted, who had ideas, which these guys supported and I supported when I was there. And they could then go and actually test this idea out as well on international markets. They got to go to Barcelona for a week and share those ideas. They didn't have companies. They just had ideas. They were pretty much always from clinically led. But then these people have already gone through that vetting process and iterations of their ideas. They've learned how to present them as business cases. These are quite good use cases for you to adopt. And maybe link up with. Maybe some other sites could do something similar. Maybe they can just do maybe a more national or even regional entrepreneur exchange type program. so that you already know that these guys are coming in with a pretty good idea. They've already talked to the right people. Then you're bringing them together to create the company, because the way you described it, because that's the next step for them, is to either create a company or sell the idea. So perhaps that's one way to do it, and I would love to see more of it. I would love to see more entrepreneurial exchanging exercises within the NHS itself.
So just to pick up on what Chris is saying, one of those sort of internal entrepreneurs has initially gained, so won the HEAP kind of competition that we ran. He then applied for some charity funding, small 10K pump priming, created a prototype that helped him to generate some proof of concept evidence. He then went to the Knowledge Asset Grant Fund, managed to secure 250K to develop a minimal viable product that in 1 year. So, and the Innovation Pop-Up supported him through that whole process. And so he has just completed that minimal viable product, is sort of on the verge of now really trying to develop what that commercial strategy looks like, and is looking for sort of the next step of funding. So I suppose to your point is that we are, as an Innovation Pop-Up, really trying to develop that entrepreneurial spirit, you know, releasing some of that sort of capital, intellectual capital that we have within the trust, and trying to develop those pathways.
Anything you want to add there to
Yeah, not much. I mean, I think most of the HRCs certainly had, you know, within their remit, the identification and communication of unmet needs, and so I think they will do a good job of that. I like that. I didn't know about the Zinc accelerator, so I think that's an interesting initiative. I think the reality is you can't stop passionate entrepreneurs. You know, many people in the audience perhaps who've started a company or developed an innovation themselves will have done so because they have a personal connection to the problem that they're trying to solve. It's often because one of their family has that particular condition, or they have, you know, some particular reason why they've started a company around that particular technology, that particular disease. So I think, you know, that will always happen. But I think, you know, if we can do more of these types of accelerators where we can set people off on problems, I think that's a good thing. I mean, you know, that there are there's lots of information out there already about, you know, what the priorities of the NHS are. There's you know, you can start from the long-term plan, you can look at the individual strategy plans for each of the ICSs and kind of understand local priorities. But I think it's kind of getting down to the granularity of, well, you know, we know diabetes costs us 10% of the budget, but, you know, which particular bit of that pathway, which particular cohort of patients, you know, can you help either with an individual solution, or, as you say, you know, how can we actually bring companies together and bring solutions together to actually make much greater impact.
Yeah, thanks, guys. So I'm going to draw things to a bit of a close, and I didn't really get the chance. Ian distracted me. I was going to ask him to inject even more of NIHR's money into innovation and health tech through things like the HRCs and other funds that might emerge as well. And I think it's been good to see the NHR actually do that over the last couple of years as well. So, you know, more please, Ian. We've talked a lot about barriers today. We've talked about the need to understand, you know, are we producing solutions that meet real clinical need? We've talked about the pathway and understanding where things work in a pathway. And we've talked a lot about evidence and evaluation as all being things to have a really good grip of if we want to really drive adoption into the NHS. And I think I'll finish by saying we've got to keep trying. We've got to keep plugging away at the NHS. We're very quick to, you know, complain and be, you know, quick to point out some of the challenges and barriers, but there's so much good that can be done by the health tech industry in the UK, and I'd encourage you all to keep your noses to the grindstone, keep working hard, and keep engaging with the system so we can make the case for change. Finally, if you'd all like to thank our panel for their time today, it's been great. Thank you, guys.